Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this evening's presentation of LD ADHD 2E, How to Support Students Who Learn Differently. My name is Jenna Burke. I'm a premium tutor and executive function coach here at Apple Ruth, and I'm so excited to discuss all of these different letters and numbers that you see before you and talk about how you can best support the student in your life. So we will have a poll a little bit later on, just so we can get a good idea of who you are and where you're coming from, what you're interested in. But please feel free to drop any questions that you might have in the Q&A chat, and I will try to leave some time at the end for your questions. But in the meantime, let's get started. So first off, Apple Ruth, this is our why. This is why we exist as a company. We know that when you change students' self-beliefs, you change their lives. And we know that that's the most important thing that we could be doing for our student. So how do we do this? We build skills for school and beyond. We work with students on academic tutoring, perhaps if they're struggling in a particular class, or test prep for high stakes testing such as the SAT, ACT, ISEE, SSAT, and a lot of other acronyms besides. And we also work with students on executive function coaching. So my goals for this evening's presentation are to identify some common learning differences, discuss common accommodations for students with LDs, and introduce strategies that you can use in your own home. But first, let's talk definitions. So I know that ADHD or sometimes ADD sort of gets tossed around a little bit, but let's actually talk about what they mean. So ADHD specifically stands for Attention Deficit / Hyperactivity Disorder. And that affects about 8.4% of American children. And usually you see it as evidence of differential brain development, delays in brain maturation, and this usually results in challenges with executive functioning, regulating attention, inhibition, things like that. ADD inattentive is characterized by difficulty holding attention on tasks easily. The student might not seem to listen or have trouble organizing tasks, and they have to exert a lot more energy to create that inhibition. And we're going to be talking about inhibition a lot. That's the ability to stop yourself from doing something. And that can be really, really difficult if you have ADD or ADHD. ADHD hyperactive is characterized by a lack specifically of physical inhibition. So with these kinds of students, they'll sort of seem on the go or driven by a motor, bouncing off the walls, that kind of thing. This kind of student might often interrupt or intrude on other people because they, again, don't have that inhibition to let them know, oh, so-and-so is talking, I should probably let them talk. And then lastly, we have ADHD combined. So you get a little from column A, a little from column B, some symptoms of inattention, and also some symptoms of hyperactivity. So what makes the ADHD brain different? So this is where I kind of geek out a little bit, because there are physical differences in an ADHD brain. So it isn't just, oh, kids these days can't pay attention. There is something going on in the brain that makes it very, very different. So first off, we've got the frontal cortex. So that's the bit in the dark blue, and that controls your attention, executive function, which I'll get into in a bit, as well as organization. So then you've got your limbic system. So that regulates emotions as well as attention. So your ability to calm yourself down, to self-regulate, that can be encouraged by the limbic system, but also held back. And there's also the basal ganglia, which can cause interbrain communication to short circuit, which presents as inattention. So that's really important. So it's a physical change that means that students aren't necessarily not paying attention to you. It's that there's a communication problem in the brain. Things aren't moving as quickly as they need to. And then lastly, we've got the reticular activating system, which is a major relay system in the brain. So again, if that starts to short circuit, that can cause inattention, impulsivity, or hyperactivity. So there's a lot of things going on in the brain that makes it really difficult to say, sit still or listen to somebody when they're asking you to do something. So the main culprits, what is going on? Why is the brain such a challenging area for students? So mostly we're looking at norepinephrine, which is made from dopamine. It's a chemical messenger that transmits nerve signals, and it increases alertness and arousal and attention. So that can affect your sleep-wake cycle as well. So if you have ADHD, you might notice that it's really hard to fall asleep, or it's really hard to get up in the morning. It also affects your mood and your memory, your ability to remember something that someone told you. Now, dopamine regulates the pleasure center of the brain. I think we all hear about dopamine a lot in, say, pop culture, right? Like chasing that dopamine. So it's hard to pay attention to something boring if you don't have dopamine, if you've got a lack of it. So think of it as like students are lacking this chemical messenger that helps them feel happy, helps them feel excited, and the teacher is going on about something that feels really boring, and that's not as exciting or fun as, say, folding a cute little origami bird on your desk. And so your brain is going to want to go towards the thing that makes you feel pleasure. On the other hand, we've got hyperfocus, which is the flip side of the coin, right? You're finally paying attention to something that brings you pleasure. And this can happen if, say, you've ever gone down like a Wikipedia rabbit hole and you realize, like, you know, an hour later, like, wow, I didn't realize I cared that much about Australian submarines, but here I am an hour later. So that is an example of hyperfocus. So that's kind of the flip side, is that finally you're able to pay attention to something that you love. So you're not going to be able to stop yourself from continuing that thing. So a lot of times I was working with a student today who was like, oh, hey, before we begin, I need to eat something because I haven't eaten anything all day. And I like kind of almost blacked out in class. So hyper focusing so much that she forgot that she needed to eat something for the day. That is absolutely something that happens. And this is why, and I think this is really important, and so I'm making my personal pitch for this. ADHD, I personally don't think of it as attention deficit. It's not that there isn't attention, it's that it's attention dysregulation. So it's more that the attention isn't able to be controlled the way that you would like, the way that you can say, okay, I may not love learning about the Holy Roman Empire, but there are things that learning about this is going to enable me to do. So I'm going to, you know, pull myself together and do it. But that's really, really hard if your attention is sort of slipping through your fingers. Or, okay, I really should go to bed. I've been, you know, reading this really cool article, which made me read this other really cool article, and now it's 2 a.m. So it's not that there isn't any focus, it's that it's not being used in a way that's really helpful for the student. And something else that's going to be a big theme of tonight's presentation, spoiler alert, is the co-occurrence of neurodiversity diagnoses. So between 31 and 45% of children with ADHD also have a learning disability of some kind. So those co-occur very, very frequently. 25 to 40% of children with dyslexia also have ADHD, and 25% of children with ADHD also have dyslexia. And ADHD also presents, and this is a very wide statistic, so take it with a grain of salt, anywhere from 30 to 80% of individuals with autism spectrum disorder. And people with autism present around 20 to 50% of people with ADHD. So there's a lot of these diagnoses are neighbors, cousins. There's definitely a lot of overlap. So while I'm going to be talking about specific kinds of learning disabilities and differences this evening, there's a lot of overlap. So just because you think that there's one thing that you need to be focusing on, it's entirely possible that there may be something else that applies to you as well. So something that can pop up a lot, regardless of the diagnosis, is executive function deficit. So let's talk about what executive function skills are in the first place. So as you can see, I've got this whole long list, and there's I'd say like 8 major categories. So planning, which is the ability to say like, oh, I want to go to this place. What do I need to do in order to get there? Prioritization. I've got a paper that's due tomorrow, and I also have a presentation that's on Thursday, and I've got this big research project that's due in 3 weeks. Which one should I start first? And sometimes if you have executive function deficits, you're going to start with the one that's the most fun, because that's the one that you can get your brain to agree to do, but that's not necessarily what you ought to be prioritizing. Then we've got organization. So if you've ever asked a student, like, where are your papers? And the answer is, they're somewhere. Organization might be a problem. Goal setting and follow through. Sometimes I'll have students with executive function deficits who set these amazing goals for themselves, but the follow through is really limited. Time management. This is a big stereotypical one, right? Where you're saying, okay, how long is that going to take you? And they say, oh, yeah, 30 minutes, but it ends up taking them 3 hours because they can't quite manage their time. Self-regulation, that's another one I was talking about. It has to do really with emotions, of understanding, how upset am I getting, and is it in proportion to what actually just happened? Self-monitoring, being aware of having issues with any of these, right? Like a lot of my students that I work with as an EF coach don't think that they have problems in these areas. Their parents might say, I'm really concerned about their ability to organize, their ability to prioritize, their time management. And then I'll talk to the student and they'll be like, oh, I'm fine. I'm doing great. Oh, okay. What are your grades like? Oh, I'm failing a couple of my classes, but I'm fine. So that ability to really look at what's happening and go, ooh, I'm getting off track here. And lastly, inhibition. And this is a really hard one, especially with brains that are still maturing. Convincing yourself to stop doing something that you know that you shouldn't really be doing because you need to do the thing that isn't fun, or getting yourself to start doing something that isn't fun. Those can be really difficult. And all of these are affected by working memory, cognitive flexibility, and self-control, which is a really big one. So let's talk about dyslexia. Now, really quickly, this is a really interesting font that I encourage you to look up. The idea behind it is that it mimics the feeling of reading if you are dyslexic. So the idea of looking at all these letters and trying to differentiate with them if, say, we were using these to create a word. So it's not exactly what a student with dyslexia sees when they read, but it's to give you that emotional feeling of, oh, this is very confusing and all of these strokes kind of look the same, and I don't know how other people are able to decode this so quickly. So it's a really fun study in empathy and understanding for what other people are going through that I really love. So let's get down to like a really specific definition for dyslexia. So dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It is usually characterized by difficulties with accurate or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. So by decoding, I mean like knowing what a word is, whereas encoding would be what we think of as, say, spelling. And these difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that's often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities, right? Like the difficulty with reading and writing doesn't seem on par with how well the student is doing in other areas. And secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience, of course, because if it's harder to read, you're not going to read a lot. That will then impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. It's really hard to learn about stuff in our society if you're not comfortable reading. Next up, the term twice exceptional. So I don't know if you're familiar with this, but the idea is that a twice exceptional student is one who is classified as both gifted and talented, but also has a learning disability. So the idea is that you might have a student who is really struggling in school, but also really excels in school at the same time. And it's just super confusing. This young person might be, dreaming of sending a rocket into space, but the teacher might not be amused because it looks like the student is goofing off. So the technical definition, thanks to the National Association for Gifted Children, is twice exceptional is used to refer to gifted children who have the characteristics of gifted students with the potential for high achievement. And they also give evidence of one or more disabilities as defined by federal or state eligibility criteria. So this includes specific learning disabilities, speech and language disorders, emotional or behavioral disorders, physical disabilities, autism spectrum, or other impairments such as ADHD. So obviously dyslexia is included in this. And just to sort of give you an idea of what this might look like. So from the teacher's perspective, teacher might see a student who has high interest in math and science, like so excited, excellent understanding and problem solving skills. But this student really, really, really struggles with any task that involves reading or writing. Getting the student to turn in homework is a struggle. Getting them to take appropriate notes is a struggle. Getting them to complete the assigned reading feels almost impossible. And from the parents' end, what they're seeing is that homework is a struggle every night. Tears, meltdowns, assignments that other students seem to complete really quickly take that student hours to do. The student's really disorganized and her backpack is a mess, but she's deeply interested in subjects that are outside of school, loves them, would talk your ear off about, say, like all the different types of birds that she's seen from one tree in 1 hour. She can talk about topics she cares about for hours. So the desire to learn is there, but she's also becoming withdrawn and says that she hates school because she's associating school with all of that homework, or maybe, taking twice as long to get an assignment done. Oftentimes with 2E students, what you might see is either they're really struggling in school, but wow, they're so bright, or gosh, this student's so bright, but you don't realize that they're pedaling like a duck furiously under the water to try to keep up with their fellow students. So let's talk about briefly a couple other learning differences, just to sort of, because as I discussed earlier, there's a lot of different learning differences that coexist with some of the major ones that we've already talked about already. Because everything isn't just ADD, right? That's the one that everyone knows about. That's the buzzword. But there are also things like memory or retrieval issues, auditory processing, visual processing, dyscalculia, which is sort of described as like dyslexia for math, which is a little simplified, but I understand why people say that, dysgraphia and dyspraxia. So those ones are where you are more likely to see, say, a student who really struggles with handwriting, students who, if you try to have them fill out a Scantron, it's an absolute disaster. That's where that's probably hanging out for them. This is a really interesting exercise. Children with dyscalculia take longer to count dot patterns. So most of us might go like, oh, okay, I'm going to do a group of 4 here, group of 4 there. So that's 8. And then there's one at the bottom. So that's 9. Whereas dyscalculics tend to count the dots one by one. And so that's going to take them longer. And that kind of thing really adds up. So let's talk about accommodations for students with LDs, because this is one of the most consequential things that you can do for a student is get them accommodations in school. Getting the right accommodations in school can solve so many issues, and it can make school a much more pleasant place for these students. Extra time can be essential for many students with learning differences because they're able to show what they know only when they have enough time. And something that I want to say really quickly is that this is not just for school. I've sometimes talked with parents who've said, well, I don't really care that, like, it's really not that important that they get accommodations in school. I'm concerned that if they get accommodations in school and then they go out to the workplace, that, they don't get those there. So what are they going to do? They've been coddled. Well, that's not actually true. The Americans with Disabilities Act includes learning disabilities as conditions where an employee may be entitled to reasonable accommodation or modification in order to ensure their ability to effectively do their job. So getting accommodations in place, getting documentation that says that this is a medical disability that I have is going to be so important, not just for school, but for life as well. So in order to get a formal accommodation plan, the student is most likely going to need to be evaluated, and not all evaluations are created equal. So here's a couple that you are most frequently going to see. So there's a psychological evaluation, or a psych eval, and that's typically intended to guide diagnosis and treatment from a medical perspective, not educational. The psychoeducational evaluation is going to incorporate a lot more of an educational perspective. It's going to be looking at the students' difficulties in the classroom, their learning style, and what is happening, right? Like the physical things that can be observed. This might not provide enough data to diagnose and recommend treatment for disabilities, but it will certainly give you a lot more information about what exactly is happening. And then the neuropsychological evaluation is a formal assessment of cognitive functioning controlled by different regions of the brain, right? So this is, trying to get as inside the brain as we can, focusing on why these difficulties are happening. And neuropsych evaluations can be used to diagnose a disability. So once you've got that diagnosis, there's a lot of different formal plans out there, IEPs, 504s, RTIs, and those are going to be found in public schools. There are also school-based official accommodation plans, and those are usually more for private school students. Mostly because private schools don't have to necessarily, obey all of the educational laws of the state that they're in. They can sometimes make up their own rules. But the evidence that you receive school-based accommodations is key if you are doing any sort of testing. So if your student is thinking, well, I'm in public school now, but I want to apply to private school. Well, a lot of private schools require an SSAT, an ISEE, the HSPT, if you're applying to Catholic school. And so getting accommodations in order to excel on those tests is going to be really, really important, not just when you get to high school, even before then. So for ADD and ADHD, the most common accommodation is extended time on tests, right? That seems to be a pretty easy one. Although I would definitely want students to try it out before they actually take the test, because sometimes, in a small number of my students, but sometimes they realize, oh, I don't want all that extra time. Like an extra, 50% amount of time sounds good in the beginning because I need more time to concentrate, but I am exhausted by the time I get to the end. So for some students, that extended time isn't as helpful, but I would definitely say, especially if this is for, say, the SAT or the ACT, I would want a student to try it out before they decide this isn't for me. You can also have instruction or assignments tailored to the student. Making sure that teachers are able to give feedback, assistive technology, which I'm a big fan of, and we can get into more on that later. Allowing extra breaks, time to move around. That's really great. Breaks where you can sort of stop the clock. That can be really helpful for students. I'll recommend, go outside, do some jumping jacks, shake your body around. It can feel really distracting to keep your body still if you have ADHD. So giving students time to move around and then come back to the test can be really, really helpful. An environment with limited distractions can be really important. Don't necessarily put a student with ADHD right next to a window, because they are going to be distracted by every single bird that flies by, every single plane that zooms overhead, if someone's yelling outside. Because their attention can't decide which is more important, the test or the sound they just heard. They're of equal importance. So limited distractions can be really helpful. Students might also need extra assistance in staying organized. I've had some of my students where the teachers have given them a list of like, hey, just so you know, this is what I'm going to be covering in class today. And that can help them format their notes, or at least expect what's going to be happening in class at any given moment. And that helps them stay organized. For dyslexia, extended time is essentially a given if you've got a diagnosis of dyslexia. That's like the standard accommodation, right? You need more time to decode these words and figure out what's going on. Students with dyslexia may receive double or even triple time, depending on how severe their disability is. Even if students don't always use a reader or text-to-speech technology, it is really important to figure out what these students need for time testing. Text-to-speech technology is getting better every day. Readers are getting more, tech savvy. I remember even just a couple of years ago, I used to be the reader for my students because I wanted them to practice with a human before they had a human reading for them on the test day, reading out loud. And the student had to be able to tell them, stop, go back. Okay, start here. And they felt a little strange ordering an adult around. So we practiced. But now if you're able to get a recording, that's going to be, one less roadblock to a student who feels like that accommodation will be helpful, but they feel a little shy about it. You can also work on how testing or assignments are presented, right? Verbal instructions instead of written. Can you repeat those instructions for me? Can you have larger print or visual prompts or cues? Response as well, marking your answers in the test book instead of on that separate answer sheet can be hugely helpful for students. Assistive technology like that audio recorder, or just being able to record class so that you can listen to it later. The setting, you could be in an individual situation or a small group, so you feel less intimidated or less embarrassed about what you perceive as your shortcomings. Or there could be an alternative furniture arrangement, like I'm going to sit in front of the teacher so that I make sure that I'm focused on them. And as I said, timing and scheduling, most popular accommodation, getting extended time, more frequent breaks to stretch, or maybe changing the order of tasks or subsets. So all of this is great when you're the teacher and you're at home, but how do you help when you're at home? I know that over the last couple of years, especially when everyone was distance learning, that this could be really fraught. So here are some ways that you can help your students stay on track. So students need instruction to change the way they view mistakes. This is something that I really try to model with my own students, that mistakes are okay. Everyone makes them. Just because you mess up a problem in math does not mean that you are doomed to be horrible in math forever and ever. You can even purposefully make mistakes in front of your students to demonstrate how you recover from them. Or, if you're not into like creating a mistake, you can just not hide it, right? The next time that you goof, make sure that your student knows that that's okay, that that's life, and the world isn't going to come crashing down around them if they make some kind of error. I really, really value strength-based focus for optimized learning, right? Like look at what you are good at, what you enjoy, and move in that direction. If you're a better listener than a reader, then listen to books. Get some assistive technology, get the tools that will help you be your best. Listening to a book you're still getting the information, just like if you were reading it. There is no superior way of getting information. If you need to play music to block out noise while doing your homework, honor that, make space for that. If you need to listen to like lo-fi jams on Spotify, go for it. I personally really like Coffeetivity. That's a website that sort of mimics the sound of a coffee shop. And I love that because it's white noisy enough that it's not going to distract me or make me start, eavesdropping on somebody else's conversation. But it does kind of give me that vibe of, oh, everybody else is working. I should probably work too. So that really works for me. If you need to throw a ball against the wall to help you study and focus, right? Because a lot of times sitting still can be really painful. Find a way to enable that without obviously bothering other people. Please don't throw a ball against the wall that happens to be your sibling's bedroom wall. That is just going to start a fight. And don't fight yourself, right? Work with your innate design. This is not a one-size-fits-all situation. Don't try to squeeze yourself into a box that is uncomfortable for you. So this is a really great one that is very helpful, partializing tasks. So you want to divide things into discrete small steps. Another way of talking about this is chunking, right? So in this case, learning how to tie your shoes can feel very overwhelming, if any of you remember how difficult that was back in the day. But if you break it down into smaller steps, it's going to feel so much more manageable. So that's what you really want to focus on. I call it chunking with my students. And so how that can be really helpful is you're just going, okay, here's this really large task. Like I have a research paper that's due next week and I'm kind of freaking out about it. Then you want to cut that down into, okay, well, I'm going to like do my like sort of outline tomorrow. And then I'm going to start researching it over the weekend. And then I'm going to do another outline where I put my research into the outline. And I'm going to do that by next Thursday. And then I'm going to, so you're breaking down the paper into smaller chunks. So that also gives you the nice adrenaline rush of, ooh, I just checked something else off my list. I just checked something else off my list. And it becomes a lot more manageable. A lot of times students with learning differences see the big task and it becomes impossible. And so they don't want to start it. And the dread just keeps building and building. And then wouldn't you know it, it's the day before the big paper is due and they haven't even started. It's also important to use dialogue and inquiry when a student gets stuck. I often joke that being an EF coach means that I'm just asking really good questions. So these are some really good questions that I would recommend. So getting a student to talk about what the situation is. So even just, can you describe what it feels like? Have you ever felt the same feeling on other tests or in other situations? What has worked in the past to get you unstuck? So reflecting on what the student has done in the past to help them out of whatever is making them stall out now can be really helpful because you're helping them to draw upon what they've done before. Because then they can say like, oh, well, I did this in the past and that worked okay. So I'm going to try that now. So helping them to draw lessons can be really great. How do you think you can move past this if and when it happens on test day, right? Like sometimes with my students, the goal is, no matter what happens, I'm not going to leave the room. So even if I get stumped on a question, I'm going to say to myself, it's just one question and I'm going to go on to the next one. And if that helps the student prevent a meltdown where they run out of the room in tears and they don't want to finish the rest of the test, then that is success, right? We don't want to pretend that they're not going to get stumped on the test. We want them to have an action plan if they do. So you want to help them approach problem solving strategically, right? Getting that prefrontal cortex involved and moving from I'm feeling frustrated and I can't control my emotions to more of an analysis and I'm going to take action. So assistive technologies, I'm a big fan, especially, in this, we've been through some COVID situations and we all realized, oh, actually, we can put things on Zoom like this tonight. We can really use technology to help people access things that they couldn't normally have. So whether this is printed notes, audio recordings of classes, a video recording of a class, if you do better listening, if you also have a picture that you can watch, an e-reader, which can sometimes be really helpful, especially if you flip if you flip the background so that it goes from white with black writing to black with white writing, that can be a little easier on some students' eyes, as well as productivity apps. I've got a whole bunch that I love, happy to recommend some if anyone's interested in the Q&A when I'm done. One of my colleagues just got a tablet where he can write notes and then they become printed notes, like they sort of get transformed into as if he was typing. And that's incredible, because to me, the best notes that you can take are ones that you're writing by hand, because you get that sort of kinesthetic memory as you're writing. But typing is a lot easier to read. My handwriting is not so great. I know that. I look back at my notes after a session with a student and I'm always thinking, what did I mean by frost the pie? So being able to get the benefits of writing and the benefits of being able to read the typed notes afterwards, amazing. Love that that is possible for us now. So assistive technologies are more accessible than ever. This is a fantastic app wheel. I strongly recommend that you all check out the program for the advancement of learning over at Curry College. This is straight from them. We've got the link right here for you. And basically, they give you these 4 categories: studying, writing, organization, and reading. And then they say, okay, well, what about studying? Are you trying to gather information? Or are you interested in improving your memory or doing mind mapping kind of activities? And then they give you suggestions for each one of those subcategories. So strong recommend. This gives you lots of really great ways to engage with technology in a helpful way. I know that personally, I live and die by my Google Calendar. If it's not in the calendar, it's not going to happen. And I also love doing shared notes with people. So I don't ever have to wonder, oh, did somebody get that at the store? If it's on the shared note and it's been crossed off, great. I don't have to worry about it anymore. One of my students hates texting, but she likes the shared note. So we have a shared note and she just crosses stuff off. So I don't have to ask her, hey, did you get that thing done? She just lets me know from afar. Now, something I've sort of touched on very briefly in the beginning, but we can go back to it now, is that social emotional difficulties are sometimes part and parcel of having an LD, whether that's ADHD or autism or dyslexia. There are a lot of ways that you can feel frustrated, whether it's with the way that your brain is behaving or whether it's the way that society is reacting to neurodiversity. There's a lot of social emotional challenges out there. So first step, you want to identify your emotions. It's really important to get to know your feelings. And there's a lot of really good visualizations that you can do to help gain distance from your thoughts. It can be really helpful to sort of imagine your thoughts as like a wave that's washing through you and then departing. I can't recommend this book, Brain Hacks, enough. It is a really fantastic book that I think it doesn't focus on a diagnosis, which I love, right? It doesn't say if you have been diagnosed with ADHD, this is the book for you. Or if you are a twice exceptional student, this is the book for you. It's for anyone. It's for anyone who's frustrated with how they're getting through the day. They feel like they're working twice as hard for not as much result. This is a really, really great book. So a lot of this social emotional sort of life hacks come from this wonderful book. So once you're identifying your emotions, you also want to be able to listen to your body. I think in this modern age, it's really easy for us to kind of get detached from our bodies. So I'd encourage you to do a body scan, just sort of check out from the head down to the toes. Where am I feeling tense? Where am I feeling loose? Am I hungry? Am I thirsty? Have I been outside? Usually, if a student is having a hard time, the answer to at least one of those is no or yes, right? Yes, I'm hungry. Oops, I forgot to drink anything. And no, I have not been outside today. So those are really good questions to even have up on the wall, just to sort of remind yourself, if you're having a really bad day, am I a yes, yes, no today? It's also really important to build emotional resilience, helping to recognize the feeling. That can be really important. Just recognizing like, oh, I feel not sad, angry. I'm angry. Also, it's important to identify the positives, which is not the same as toxic positivity, where you're like, you should just be grateful that you're here. More like, okay, that test didn't go well, but at least I studied for it. Last time I didn't even bother studying. So next time I want to figure out, right? This is the create an action plan part. Next time I'm going to figure out, maybe I should start studying not the night before. Maybe I should like give myself a little bit more time. And then lastly, managing those negative emotions, giving yourself permission to grieve, to be upset. You didn't make the school play, that really stinks. And you can feel sad about it. That is okay. But you also want to be able to build your tolerance for uncertainty. When you audition for the school play, you don't know if you're going to get in, and that's okay. We want to make sure that our students feel comfortable with doing something and not having control over what happens. So let's get a little specific. So my friends with ADHD, you want to look for the strength in the diagnosis, right? There's a reason why brains have evolved in different ways. Sometimes people with ADHD, when they find themselves hyper-focusing, that's helpful. If you need to like get a lot of stuff done, that's great that you can just sort of zoom in and like get things done in a long amount of time. Everything in life has pluses and minuses. Right? ADD does not mean that this is an immediate disaster. Nothing in life is perfect, and ADD just means that there are different things that you do well than other people. So along with this, don't fight the fidget. If someone wants to wiggle around, let them. I had a student who would always draw orbits on his paper whenever we worked together. I didn't take it personally. He wants to grow life on Mars, and that's awesome. More power to him. So I'm going to let him doodle while we work on math because I know he's paying attention to me. He just needs to move somehow. It can also be really helpful to students if they annotate or actively read, because annotating the text gives them something to do instead of just passively sort of staring at the book. So don't spend time inhibiting that impulse to move. Just let them move, let them walk around. Also shake up the topics. I love the Pomodoro technique, the idea being that you work in 25-minute chunks and then you take a 5-minute break. I love that. For a student with ADHD, it might even be smaller intervals, right? 15 minutes of grammar, 20 minutes of break, 15 minutes of math, 20 minutes of break, 15 minutes of science, like shake it up, let the student get a reboot and like let their brain do something else. Also, I talked before about breaking things into chunks. This is another great way to do it, breaking large projects up or looking at full sections of an assignment in smaller chunks, or setting short time limits and smaller goals. I couldn't agree more. 2 minutes is better than no minutes, right? Smaller is going to feel more surmountable. And like I said, you want to incorporate short breaks into your study sessions. And these need to be not looking at your phone breaks. They need to be moving, walking, stretching, go outside, sniff the air. Or maybe if you're the person assisting the student with their homework, talk with them, chat about their hobbies, their life, something that isn't the homework. Just let them take their mind off of it a little so that they can reset. And distractions are going to happen, right? I think if a student is worried about forgetting something that they wanted to talk with you, which often is why students with ADHD interrupt a lot because they don't want to forget the thing, just have a pad of paper or a whiteboard nearby so they can write it down and they can discuss it with you later. And then once they've done that, the thought isn't hanging around in their head, just like not letting go. Working with students with executive function deficits, which is, a lot of students with ADHD, but of course, there's a lot of students with LDs who also have EF deficits. So if you remember these executive function skills, if you have deficits like those, really try to keep the to-do list for the day are like 3 things at the most. And you want to go slowly, point by point, helping them set up goals, build their to-do list, Technology is really helpful. Again, working in those 20-minute increments, taking mental breaks, and having a homework book where all the information is recorded. I don't care if it's analog. I love bullet journals. Happy to chat about that with people when I'm done with the presentation, or a digital note where they're keeping track of all their homework, but they need to have it written down somewhere. And attitude is everything, right? Anytime a student makes progress, you want to highlight it and praise them and show them that they did something really excellent. A lot of times students with EF issues are really hard on themselves anyway, because they're seeing everybody else seemingly breezing through life. And it's really easy to get down about that. And success breeds success. The more that a student sees them succeeding, the more confident they are to go, oh, well, maybe I'll try this next time. And then they get more success. And remember, self-efficacy is the goal. We want to make sure that eventually students don't need us at all. That's when we know that we've succeeded. I already spoke about Google Calendar. It's the best. Love it. Students can track short-term projects, long-term projects. They can schedule in downtime, playtime, going to the gym. You can create different calendars that are color-coded. You can totally nerd out so that you don't have to keep it all in your head. For dyslexia, technology is your friend, right? Digital books come with built-in accommodations like changing the font to something friendlier. Text-to-speech assistive technology can help students get through material faster. The recommendations section of the neuropsych report, always worth a refresher. So if you do work with a neuropsychologist or neuropsychiatrist, their report is going to have a section that is just titled recommendations. And it's going to tell you so many different things that you or a student's tutor or teacher can be doing to support. And dyslexia does impact math. So don't forget that your student may need support there as well. It's not all reading. And remember that this is not one size fits all. Some students need to slow down and read every single word. Other students are going to benefit from using mnemonics or coming up with songs or rhymes or funny visuals to help encode that information into their long-term memory. Some students respond really well to active reading, annotating when they're reading. So using deliberate focus and engagement, underlining things. Sometimes I find it's helpful to take a pencil and just sort of boop each word as you're reading so that you don't accidentally skip over something or assume that it's a word that it actually isn't. So this is what I mean by active reading. I've been talking about it a little bit tonight. So this is what I want it to look like. So you're underlining important information, circling transition words or names, starring the main ideas, summarizing those paragraphs with a few keywords. Think of it like a little hashtag, and that can help the brain to create a visual picture of where information is located in a passage, especially if this passage doesn't have as much white space, which makes it more technically difficult for people with reading difficulties. I love active reading. It helps you, it makes your brain think that you're like on a treasure hunt and you're looking for something really interesting, and it can help trick you into thinking something's interesting, even if it isn't. It's also really important to deeply engage with the text, right? Long texts can be really intimidating, especially if a student is self-conscious about how long it takes them. So I'd say, like, cover up more paragraphs, cover up the other diagrams, anything distracting, just let them focus on one paragraph at a time. Bracket the first and last sentence of the paragraph if a student needs just to remember, like, what could my main idea be? The more that a student is physically engaged with the text, the more helpful that's going to be for students with dyslexia. Speaking of like looking for the positive with students, this is another fantastic book. I know this wasn't really supposed to be Jenna's book club, but I think that's what tonight's turning into. This is a wonderful book called The Dyslexic Advantage. It takes a deep dive into the hidden benefits of having dyslexia. It includes examples, in-depth interviews with people with dyslexia who are making a difference in their fields by using their gifts. Really strong recommendation from me. It's really incredible reading about the ways in which dyslexic minds just work so well with, say, like three-dimensional reasoning. I would get lost in a straight hallway, and it's really fantastic reading about the ways in which dyslexic minds can really thrive. If you or someone you love is a person with memory or retrieval issues, just limit the amount of information to be learned during any one study session, right? Shorter sessions are best, short and sweet. Anytime you're introducing anything new, have the student review any prior knowledge so that they're adding onto what they already know. So they've got something to sort of tack it onto. And you want to space out those study sessions to allow the student to rehearse and reinforce that learned material. Forced recall is really important when you're studying. So the feeling of sitting there going, oh, what was that thing, is actually the best thing that you can do to force your brain to remember something. So the more you space out study sessions, the more you're forcing your brain to remember. You also want to use dual encoding. So look at something visually, listen to something, like as many different ways of getting that information into your brain as possible. You want to encourage your student to rehearse that information just after learning, or definitely within 24 hours, to strengthen that encoding, write down key concepts in a meaningful, structured way so that they can remember them later, and then getting back into forced retrieval in different environments, right? If you're always studying in your room, have someone quiz you in the kitchen. Make sure that it's not just in one place that you can remember everything. If you've got auditory processing issues, you always want to make sure you're facing that person when you're speaking and be in close proximity. Get rid of any other distracting sounds in the environment. So my fun Coffeetivity website, not for students with auditory processing issues. You're making everything twice as hard. You want to make sure that you're articulating clearly at a good pace, that your directions are short and to the point, and that the student can always ask questions. It breaks my heart when students feel like they really can't ask questions of anyone. If you have a student with math challenges, make sure that they slow everything down. They write down all of their work. I don't know why everyone wants to do everything in their head, but it will not help you. And you want to help your student figure out what's relevant information and what's just there to distract. Have the student articulate the steps that are involved in solving a given problem and figuring out, okay, this is how I'm going to attack it. And again, reviewing those previously taught concepts, making sure that everything is building upon the previous idea. So, in summary, every brain is different. There is no cookie cutter approach. Every student is their own student. Overall, it's always going to be helpful to be super positive and reinforcing and affirming. The goal is that we're building self-efficacy. We want the student to feel that they can accomplish anything. So any individual grade is not as important as the shift in self-concept and belief. And failing is part of that. If your student learns that they can fail and they can pick themselves up and try again, that's an important skill. You need to be flexible, responsive, and creative when you're working with students with LDs. That's why I love working with them. Help them to emphasize strategy and strategic problem solving. Excuse me. And you want to put your student at the center where they can gain that sense of agency, including helping them learn how to advocate for themselves, advocating for accommodations, making sure that they're being treated fairly. That's also a really great life skill to have. So lastly, every student is different, and we would be happy to make a custom recommendation for your student. I'm going to drop a link in the chat to a Calendly link to talk with one of our wonderful Apple Ruth, let's see here, Apple Ruth advisors. Oh, thank you so much for dropping that in the chat for me. So if your student is taking a high stakes test like the PSAT, SAT, ACT, SSAT, etc., let us help them prepare for it. If your student is struggling in a specific subject, let us match them with a tutor who can help make those concepts click. And if your student needs support getting organized, let our coaches help them build the skills that they need to succeed. We've got a diagnostic package for EF coaching. If you're interested, you can uncover growth areas and strengths with MindPrint, which is a really exciting assessment that's included. You get a custom coach match, a 30-minute one-on-one consultation with that coach, and a custom coaching plan. And lastly, very shiny new, we have a writing workshop. So this is best for students grades 5 through 12 with a hand-selected tutor for a one-on-one experience. It's a 5-part curriculum, your pace, your schedule. We'd recommend at least 5 private tutoring hours for this workshop. I've taught it myself. It's really fun. It includes grammar and rhetoric and structure and lots of things that students are going to need in middle school and beyond. So now I know we started a little bit late, but if anyone has any questions, I would be delighted to answer them. So just drop them in the Q&A, and I would love to chat with you guys for a couple more minutes before I let you all go. So let's see. Oh, this is a great question. What do I do if I've got a student who has like the best of intentions, but is always leaving things half finished? Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that I've been working on actually with some of my students, where one of my students said she was so frustrated because she had done the assignment, but she hadn't turned it in. So she got 50%. And it was just infuriating to her that she tried so hard. She thought she tried so hard, but she hadn't turned it in. And so it felt like it didn't count for anything. So what I am working with her on is something called OTO, which is a movement that basically means only touch it once. So the idea is that once you've touched something, you don't put it back down until you're finished with it. So a good example would be, I'm going to tell on myself here, but here it goes. I am that person who will finish a bottle of seltzer water in the fridge, and then I will leave it out on the counter and I will forget to refill it. I know none of you want to live with me. I understand, it doesn't hurt my feelings. And I realized that I have the best of intentions. I never put that down and think, I'm just going to leave that there. I always think, oh, I'm going to put that right there. I'm going to take out the trash and I'll do it as soon as I get back. And then I get distracted by something else. And then, oh, would you look at that? 5 hours have gone by and now I want some nice cold water and there's none to be had. So with the rules of only touch it once, as soon as I've touched that seltzer bottle, I need to finish the movement. As soon as I've poured it into my glass, I now need to go to the sink and fill it up and then put it in the machine and then put it back in the fridge, and then it's done. If I just leave it on the counter, the next time I deal with it, I'm going to have to touch it twice. So where that comes in handy with students is if you are only touching it once, that means once you do the homework, it needs to go right into your backpack. If it stays on the desk, you're going to have to touch it again before you put it in the backpack. And the likelihood that you're going to forget instead of touching it that one more time is pretty high. So if you can help your students see that you need to complete the movement before you can move on to something else, that can be a really handy mind trick. All right, I think we've got time for just a couple more questions. So if you have one, just drop it in the Q&A. Okay. Can you give me more details on the Pomodoro method? Yes, absolutely. So the Pomodoro method is one of those ideas where it started out as just like, it's called the Pomodoro method because it started out with somebody just grabbing their kitchen timer and it looked like a tomato, and they set the timer for 25 minutes and they said, okay, I'm going to do this thing for 25 minutes. And then it dinged, they set the timer for 5 minutes as a break, it dinged again, and then they went back to work. So that's why it's called the Pomodoro timer. It doesn't actually have anything to do with tomatoes. That's just the story for how it was created. But there are so many different apps that will do this for you. The ones that I've got on my phone right now, let's see, I've got Focus Keeper, which is a cute little tomato icon on there. And I really like that one because I can label my different timers. So if I want to focus on one subject for 25 minutes and then the next one's going to be something else, I can track how much time I'm using on different subjects. I can decide, okay, well, I want this next break to be a little bit longer because I've been sitting in one place for a really long time and my legs are starting to hurt. It can be really flexible. But there's a million different apps that you can look for that are all really, really helpful. And the way that I see it, if we all have our phones on us 24/7, we might as well make them work for us a little bit more. All right, I think I've got time for maybe one more question. I don't want to hold you all too long. Let's see. Wonder if your children has many signs of ADHD and executive function issues, but he doesn't agree. Ooh, yeah, absolutely. So I would say that it might be helpful to have your child talk with their pediatrician. A lot of times pediatricians, they're not the one who can necessarily diagnose, but they can start that conversation. I think a lot of times there's a stigma, right? About like, well, I don't want to be that person with ADHD. I don't want to be that person who struggles with EF skills because like all the kids are going to make fun of me. I like to phrase it with my students as saying it is never a bad idea to understand how your brain works, right? There's no downside to that. And what can be really interesting and helpful is if you do get, say, a neuropsych report or something like that, that it'll say, it'll give very detailed, like this is where you are on this percentile for this kind of reasoning and this percentile for that kind of reasoning. So, I would say, what's there to lose, right? Like we go and you're right. You don't have ADHD. You don't have any sort of executive function dysregulation. You're good. You can still do EF coaching, even if you don't have a diagnosis, right? Like I would say, a lot of times what my generation jokingly calls like adulting is basically a lot of executive function skills. So even if you don't have a diagnosis, or even if your child refuses to get one, they can still work with a coach on how do we make life easier for you? How do we make it less of a struggle? Any suggestions for dealing with overwhelming anxiety and ADHD, breaking through the negative association with a subject or a teacher? Absolutely. So first of all, if the anxiety is getting in the way of the student living a full and happy life, I'm always going to recommend seeing a therapist. I think that, I feel like every day I see something in the news about rising levels of anxiety, especially in children. And I think that that's something that we're all going to be dealing with for a really long time. So if this is affecting the way that your child is living, if they're having extreme emotional disruption before a particular class, or they're, going on crying jags before they take a math test, that's something that you're going to want to talk to a mental health professional about. If it's more about breaking through the negative association with a subject or a teacher, I would say that working with a tutor can be really helpful, because that tutor can get in there and say, like, look, you did that right. Like, this was a really difficult problem, and let me show you all the different ways in which you did everything that you were supposed to do. Which sometimes, especially if they're at a math level that is maybe beyond like what you remember from when you were in high school, it can be hard to say to a student, like, you understood that problem if you don't understand the problem. I certainly do not tutor calculus. So I would say that being able to have somebody who really understands that material and is able to validate the student and show them that they are improving can be really helpful. And let's see. Last one, and I think we will have to wrap up unless you have a very good question. What advice do you have about what to say to a high school child who feels they are less capable because of ADHD struggles? Ooh, oh, my heart. Yeah, so I would say to them that everyone struggles, right? I think it's a pretty common statement that you see a lot, where, like, social media is everyone's highlights reel, not the making of reel. You're only seeing, usually in life, you're only seeing what people want to present to you. So just because it feels like you're the only one who is struggling doesn't mean that that's actually the case. And other people may be having similar struggles to you. You don't know what other people's diagnosis is. I would also say that there's a lot with there's a lot that working with ADHD and recognizing that you have it and doing something proactively to manage it can really help you understand the way that your brain works and the way that you work a lot better than neurotypical students who have never been asked to look inside themselves in that kind of way. I often think to myself, what would my life have been like in high school if someone had taught me how to study? Right. I kind of got to high school and it sort of felt like everyone was expecting me to know what to do. You've gotten this far, you're in various AP classes, surely you know how to study. And I always felt like I was learning as I went along, definitely some imposter syndrome. And then going to college was another huge adjustment. So I think what can be helpful for students in high school, especially, to remember when they have ADHD is that everyone is going to have this struggle. Everyone is going to have a moment where they realize, oh, I'm behind in this class, or I really did not think ahead on this project. And it's great that you're doing it now in high school as opposed to in college, right? Because it always feels like the stakes are only going to get higher. So now is a great time to figure it out and to understand yourself as well as you can, because you're the person that you're going to be with for the rest of your life. So you want to get to know yourself as much as you can, as quickly as you can. So I hope your high school student hangs in there. And they are very, very capable. We have a lot of wonderful tutors at Apple Ruth, incredibly smart individuals who have all kinds of LDs, and that doesn't limit what they're able to do. It doesn't limit how they're able to help students. And I would just really encourage that student to see how far she's come and what she's learned about herself in this time, or what he or what they have learned about themselves. All right. Thank you all so much. I think it is high time that we wrap it up, but thank you so much for all of those wonderful questions. It was really great getting to speak with all of you this evening, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night.